What do you imagine is one of the most dangerous vehicles on the road in terms of rollover? You may be surprised to hear that it's a vehicle commonly used by schools, daycare centers, scout troops, churches, and hotels. It's the 15-passenger van. It looks like any other van, except it's been lengthened to hold more riders. The trouble is, when you put those extra passengers on board, the van is 3 times more likely to roll over in an emergency. All the American car makers build a version of the van. Ford sells the most. And in a moment, you'll hear some of what Ford has known about the safety of its van and how long Ford has known it. But first, have a look at the van in which you or your children might be riding tomorrow. Step off a plane, and the airport hotel is likely to pick you up in a 15-passenger van. Back home at the daycare center, the kids are climbing aboard. Often it's the shuttle for the park and ride, the lift to the university. The Y drives them. The post office, too. And when disabled American veterans move en masse to lobby Congress, it's the 15-passenger van that carries them. They seem to be everywhere. There are about 500,000 of them on the road. Millions of Americans who ride in them don't give them a second thought until the unique character of the van is suddenly, tragically revealed. That's what happened to the First Baptist Church of Piedmont, South Carolina, when it sent its children on a Bible retreat. Their 15-passenger van rolled on the highway. Andrew and Joshua Wood were among those inside.
He was laying there in the bed, unconscious, and with his eyes closed. He had some
Deborah
bandages.
Wood rushed to Joshua's hospital bed when she heard about the accident. His brother Andrew wasn't seriously hurt, but Joshua was unconscious, and his mother, a former nurse, had a terrible fear.
I spoke to him as I put my hand on his forehead, and I opened his eye, and the nurse behind me gasped when I did that. I'm sure she didn't expect me to do that because his pupils were fixed and dilated, and I'll never forget seeing that.
What did that mean?
That's an indication of severe brain damage.
What happened?
I sat with him during the night and talked to him and sang to him and prayed with him.
Joshua did not regain consciousness?
No, he never regained consciousness. The physician just turned to me and said, "Your son is brain dead. There's nothing further we can do."
Since 1990, at least 424 people have been killed and hundreds seriously injured in rollovers. These women were among the survivors in a Dodge 15-passenger van rollover last spring.
We lost 4 wonderful ladies that day.
Nancy Ramsey was one of 12 ladies of the First Assembly of God Church in Burkburnett, Texas, who were on a shopping trip when their van rolled. Among the dead were Eileen Hinestrosa, Patricia Oliver, Virginia Bean, and Dorothy Griffin, the driver. Wanda Jenkins is one of 8 survivors.
Well, the only thing I remember is Dorothy is trying to control it the best she could. But it just, to me, it seemed like it had a mind of its own.
A mind of its own. You can see what she means on a test track. The vans are not unstable under normal conditions. The trouble starts with emergency maneuvers, a quick turn of the wheel to avoid an obstacle, or when a tire tread comes off. The problem, according to auto safety experts, is the design, the weight and balance of the van. Just look at how the 15-passenger van compares to a regular van. On most models, the car manufacturers have used the same wheelbase. We've lined these 2 vehicles up wheel to wheel. But you can see on the 15-passenger model, the back end has been extended. That means when it's fully loaded, there's a seat with 4 passengers behind the rear axle. That tends to make the back end heavy, so that when there's a sudden swerve, the rear end can swing out. The second critical issue is that the van is top-heavy. It has what engineers call a high center of gravity. And the more people on board, the more top-heavy it becomes.
He has to turn away from
Milt Chase is an authority on rollovers. He's an engineer who led the design of computer software that Ford uses to test rollover resistance.
I don't think a vehicle with their rollover rate should be on the road.
Chase showed us how, in his opinion, the design of the van caused this Texas accident in the year 2000. He was hired to analyze the crash for a lawsuit against Ford. 4 athletes from Prairie View A&M University were killed when the driver swerved to miss a car.
So when he comes in to make this second turn, the back end, which is heavy, swings around.
Yes, you can see the back end swinging around. The tires on the outside of the turn at the same time maintain their grip on the road. And that's enough to pull the vehicle over.
Because the center of gravity is high enough that when the tires dig in sideways, if you will,
yeah,
over it goes.
Over it goes.
Essentially, it trips over its own wheels. This is a scientific reconstruction of the Prairie View crash. The van rolled between 4.5 and 6 times, nearly covering the length of a football field. Ford builds the most 15-passenger vans, followed by Dodge. GM has just 5% of the market and an even smaller fraction of the fatal rollovers. The GM van is a different design. The wheelbase is longer. Engineers say that lowers the chance that the van will skid sideways. But when loaded, the GM is still top-heavy, much like the Ford and the Dodge. Ford calls its van the E350. It started building them about 25 years ago. And according to a former Ford engineer, there was reason to question the van's stability from the very start. John Stilson has testified against Ford in lawsuits. He told us what he saw on Ford's test track back in the 1970s when a prototype of the van went into a series of hairpin turns.
They have 3 or 4 hairpins, and they have to drive the vehicle through these hairpins when the vehicle's on the test track. And when the vehicle went through those maneuvers and into those curves, I could see that an experienced test driver was having a very terrible time trying to control the vehicle.
On a test track with an experienced driver.
That's right.
What hope does a coach, a housewife, a choir director have?
None. Not if that rear end breaks free. The vehicle's going to go unstable.
Ford had another indication in 1993. That year, the company gathered federal crash statistics that showed that the 15-passenger van was a standout with a high rate of fatal rollovers compared to other trucks and vans. 6 years after its internal analysis, Ford built the van that killed those 4 Prairie View A&M track stars: Vernon James, Jerome Jackson, Houston Watson, and Jason Stearns. Patricia Stearns, Jason's mother, saw it on the news.
I saw the black bag that he had. It was a set of luggage that he had received from, the family. And as a mother, you just feel these things, and you know.
Jeff Wigington is a lawyer who represented the Stearns family in a suit against Ford.
Our accident wasn't the first, and it wasn't the first by any means. There have been hundreds of people killed in E350 van rollovers.
College sports teams were hit hard in the year 2000. Just look at this string of rollovers. January 13th, the Kenyon College swim team, 1 dead. The next week, DePaul University's women's track team, 3 injured. The week after that, the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh swim team, 2 seriously injured. And the week after that, Prairie View A&M. All of these vans were Fords. This series of crashes caught the attention of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. It investigated the van's record and issued a rare warning concerning the Ford, Dodge, Chevrolet, and GMC vans. The warning says the risk of rollover increases dramatically as the number of occupants increases. The agency studied single vehicle accidents in which at least 1 person was killed and found that with 10 or more passengers, 85% of the crashes involved a rollover. You may wonder whether there are any standards for rollover resistance. The government doesn't require any. So we asked former Ford engineer John Stilson about Ford's internal standards.
Ford Motor Company has its own standards for rollover resistance.
Yes, they are internal standards.
And they use those guidelines in developing their vehicles.
Some vehicles.
Some vehicles?
Yes.
Which vehicles?
Well, the vehicles other than vehicles that weigh more than 8,500 pounds.
And the 15-passenger van is over 8,500 pounds.
Yeah, in fact, in the vans and wagons, that's the only one that's over 8,500 pounds.
Why would they do that?
Because it cannot pass the test. It's that simple.
This is one rollover resistance test, a computer simulation that Ford does run on most of its vehicles, but not the 15-passenger van. Since Ford doesn't run the test, we asked engineer Milt Chase to run it for us.
The result of the test was what?
The result of the test was that in the gross vehicle weight, or the most heavily loaded case, the vehicle rolled over at least 3 times out of 4. So it's a disaster in a sense.
Ford has argued in the past that computer simulation doesn't reproduce the real world. So we looked in on a series of tests that were being run on a track in preparation of a lawsuit against Ford. Robert Hooker with Alisco Systems of Colorado runs vehicle tests in dozens of lawsuits against car makers. Here, Hooker is testing a 1995 Ford 15-passenger van. It's a test for a lawsuit involving the crash of a South Carolina church van in the year 2000. The test van was loaded with water tanks to simulate 13 passengers plus the driver. Instruments were attached to record steering, speed, all the forces on the van. Remember that computer test? Well, this is the same test on the ground. The van tipped over on its outriggers at 40 miles an hour. At slower speeds, the van did better. It did not lift off the ground in 2 tests at 25 miles an hour and 1 at 30 miles an hour. This is another test, the double lane change. It's designed to simulate an emergency maneuver. This time, the van tipped at 35 miles an hour. The final test is one engineers call the fish hook. It's designed to push a vehicle to its tipping point. The van lifted up at 35 miles an hour. Ford argues that those tests are unreliable. In fact, in 1999, in a 15-passenger van lawsuit, Ford's lawyers said that Hooker's tests were outrageous stunts with the sole aim of tipping up the vehicle. But the judge in the case allowed the tests, and a jury ordered Ford to pay the victims about $20 million. The case is still under appeal. Ford declined an interview for this story, but it did send us this letter, which says, in part, Ford tests its 15-passenger Econoline van in a broad set of handling evaluations, including extreme maneuvers beyond the capability of normal drivers. Ford wrote, "The vehicle meets our stringent internal guidelines, which contain an ample margin of safety." But Ford also included these words of caution for drivers: avoid sharp turns, excessive speed, and abrupt maneuvers. We asked engineer Milt Chase about that advice.
There can be situations, something falling off a truck in front of us or someone darting out or a deer. We're going to not be able to brake soon enough, and the only thing that can avoid a collision is to swerve. And to say avoid that avoidance maneuver is asking something unreasonable.
The accidents keep coming. It happened again last week when a U.S. Marshals van carrying federal prisoners rolled in Texas. 2 were killed. The week before in Florida, another rollover and 15 injured. They are accidents all too familiar to survivors like Rosalie McCarty from that church van rollover in Texas.
I fear for the people that have them, for the churches, the different organizations that have these vans. The colleges, we were in Oklahoma City at a college, and there was 5 of them, just like ours, parked out there. And I cringe at the thought of anyone getting in those vans.
Deborah Wood, whose son Joshua was killed in 1996, says she notices the vans now all over town.
Every time I see one, I just always say a prayer for the people that I see on those vehicles.
Both Daimler Chrysler and General Motors declined interviews. GM told us that its longer wheelbase results in a more stable vehicle that allows the driver more control. Chrysler said its 15-passenger van is subjected to a wide range of strenuous handling and stability maneuvers, but it added that the vans require the driver to understand the unique characteristics of the van. Safety experts tell us that to drive a 15-passenger van with greater safety, it must be loaded with no more than 10 passengers. Those passengers should be seated toward the front, and seat belts are essential. It's also important to maintain the tires. In the words of one engineer we talked to, the tires on a 15-passenger van must never fail.
Log on to CBS.com to see the full-length crash simulation.